sambil periksa PowerPoint. Oke, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat pagi, Bapak Ibu, rekan-rekan semua. Pertama-tama, saya sangat berbahagia sekali akhirnya agenda dari Departemen Antropologi untuk membuka semester ini dengan sebuah public lecture terlaksana meskipun dengan kondisi yang politik dan sosial yang tengah krisis. Tapi saya berbahagia sekali Pak Dekan mengizinkan kami dari Departemen Antropologi, karena bagian antropologi juga untuk bisa mengarrange. Tidak, karena kita tidak ingin dihantui karena dengan judul public lecture hari ini kita akan bicara mengenai ontologi. Saya senang akhirnya kita bisa membuka semester ini dengan sebuah public lecture yang memang sudah direncanakan sejak awal tahun, Pak Byron dan teman-teman semua. Karena ini adalah bagian dari upaya awal kami untuk membuat research cluster based activity. So kita integrate community engagement, research dan teaching. Dan Pak Byron kita punya 3 cluster. Salah satunya adalah Global Health, Wellbeing and Care yang dipimpin dan diketuai Chair Pak Irwan Martua Hidayana. Saya sendiri just recently convert to medical karena COVID. So begitu banyak riset saya di Kalimantan akhirnya berfokus kepada infrastruktur, biomedical infrastructure. Saya senang sekali akhirnya ini bisa dimulai dan saya senang sekali juga kita bisa start ini sekaligus untuk membuka dialog dan interaksi antara student, juga beberapa associate fellow kami dan juga mahasiswa dan juga teaching untuk bisa memulai percakapan yang urgent dan matters di sini. Pembuka saya mungkin ingin menempatkan kuliah umum ini dalam kerangka visi misi Departemen Antropologi yang baru dirumuskan 2023 awal, yang memang bervisi mengapresiasi dan menganalisis jalinan kehidupan sosial, biologis dan kultural yang beragam. Dan salah satu fokus utamanya adalah membuat kerangka kajian riset dan teaching yang berorientasi untuk meningkatkan kehidupan yang rentan. Dan kami memang sudah membicarakan dari awal dengan Mas Aryo dan Klaster untuk bisa melibatkan berbagai profesor dan jejaring kami yang bisa membantu kami belajar mengenai bagaimana membuat sebuah riset dan juga mengkonstruksi pendekatan dan teori di departemen kami dengan theoretically engaged tapi juga ethically engaged dengan deliverables. Jadi Pak Byron ini launching awal kami berupa public lecture. Terima kasih sudah berkenan di sini. Terima kasih Mas Aryo juga sudah mengkonek kami ke Pak Byron, Pak Irwan dan juga teman-teman semua yang sudah hadir. Saya berharap sekali diskusi yang akan dibawa hari ini akan bisa membuat kita mendapatkan 2 sisi. Jadi mendapatkan perspektif kontemporer mengenai dan yang relevan dan mutakhir dalam memahami isu-isu mengenai kekerasan dan bicarakan the vulnerable. Dan kedua, sebetulnya kita juga berharap kita juga bisa berefleksi pula dengan kondisi hari ini di mana suasana kampus tengah dalam kondisi seperti ada hantu. Tapi kita semua bingung masing-masing dengan hantu yang ada di benaknya masing-masing tentunya. Dan mungkin akan banyak hal yang bisa kita refleksikan dan saya berharap sekali melihat abstrak dan salah satu keyword di dalam judul ini mengenai hidden violence, kekerasan yang tidak tersembunyi, kasat mata yang tidak selalu muncul obvious, yang bisa kita refleksikan ke depannya. Sekali lagi terima kasih Pak Byron dan juga teman-teman semua. Saya sekedar pembuka saja untuk menempatkan public lecture ini dalam konteks apa yang akan kita kembangkan bersama di Departemen of Anthropology. Saya pikir acara ini bisa dimulai. Terima kasih Bapak Ibu semua. Untuk berikutnya saya akan serahkan ke Pak Irwan sebagai chair untuk memoderatori dan sekilas memperkenalkan acara ini dan juga Bapak Irwan. Silakan. Ya. Terima kasih. Selamat pagi semuanya. Pagi. Selamat datang kembali pada Pak Byron. Jadi sebenarnya Pak Byron ini adalah kuliah yang kedua, pertama kali tahun 2014 datang ke sini gitu ya. Dan tenang sekali hari ini beliau bisa hadir lagi gitu kan. Oke, jadi mungkin secara singkat saya hanya memperkenalkan bahwa Pak Byron Good ini adalah profesor dari Medical Anthropology, khususnya di Department of Global Health and Social Medicine, Harvard Medical School ya. Jadi tadi sambil ngobrol Pak Byron bilang bahwa sepanjang karirnya sebagai antropolog, dia digaji oleh Fakultas Kedokteran. Jadi jarang gitu ya, kebanyakan antropologi di Departemen Antropologi walaupun Pak Byron juga affiliated ya di Departemen Antropologi at Harvard University. Nah tentu saja beliau juga memang pernah menjadi former president the Society for Psychological Anthropology 2013 to 2015 dan tentu saja salah satu publikasi yang menjadi bisa dikatakan di dalam medical anthropology adalah foundational text adalah medicine, rationality, and experience gitu ya. Dan kemudian setelah itu beliau juga mengedit ataupun juga menulis sejumlah buku ya khususnya terkait dengan isu-isu mental health di mana beliau tadi mengatakan sejak tahun 96 sehingga sekarang beliau itu paling tidak setahun 2 kali datang ke Indonesia gitu ya untuk research gitu ya. Jadi memang udah long ethnographic field work di Indonesia. Mungkin begitu saja perkenalan singkat. Jadi saya and then now Pak Byron Good, the floor is yours. Okay. 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 So this one for maybe there is a slight delay. Okay. Oke, terima kasih banyak untuk kesempatan bisa ikut ke sini setelah itu betul itu saya kira tahun 2014 itu datang dan waktu itu bicara tentang yang Aceh juga saya ingat tapi ini yang misalnya dari Indonesia saya bicara sama saya ada lecture untuk psikolog, untuk dokter, untuk itu dan ya agak jarang bicara khusus untuk antropolog dan hari ini saya senang sekali.
Oke, lebih sering sama Imam.
Saya bisa ikut untuk bicara I can speak in anthropology language. So saya senang sekali bisa ikut di sini dan untuk lecture ini laporkan sama bahasa Inggris saja karena sudah ditulis itu. Okay, tapi so let me begin. So first of all, just again, thank you for the invitation. Ini betul-betul seperti dihantui oleh yang kemarin. Sama singkat, tahun 98, Bung Merijo dan saya mau pulang dari Jogja. Datang tanggal Juli, saya ingat 29-30 Juli yang 96 itu 97 baru ini ada hancuran di mana-mana itu dari PDI.
Ya
sudah kantor PDI ya. Dan waktu kami datang dari airport kurang dari setengah jam ke Hotel Borobudur karena di mana-mana gang tidak satu pun mobil ada di jalan.
So itu yang ada sekarang sepertinya hantu dari waktu itu juga. I didn't go. It's not going early. Oh. Okay. In November 2005, just 3 months after the Helsinki Accords and just after Prof. Joe and I had agreed to lead a psychosocial needs assessment project for IOM, I traveled to Aceh to begin arranging to launch a program of mental health activities. It was an eerie time. The MOU had been signed in August. That was August 15, 2005, exactly 20 years ago. I traveled to the small town of Sigli, where the mayor had just invited a former GOM combatant to take up office in the local government to build a transition to peacetime. We were invited to meet with this former combatant for lunch. He cautiously joined us at a small restaurant looking out over the alun-alun after driving by several times. I remember clearly looking to see if it would be safe to come. Because if he had come into town 6 months earlier, he would have been killed immediately. So he chatted with us and pledged to support our efforts. I returned directly from Aceh to the annual meeting November of the American Anthropology Association, where I was supposed to give a talk for a panel on the uncanny in anthropology. American anthropologists, just a word of background, unlike European anthropologists, have deep roots in psychological anthropology. So having like a conversation with anthropology, with Freud, anthropology with the uncanny, and from that coming out something like studying of hauntology is quite natural in American anthropology in a way that seems very different for European anthropologists. I just spoke at the European Network for Psychological Anthropologists. They're all kind of apologetic for doing psychology and psychological anthropology, whereas that's the heart of American anthropology. Anyhow, I returned from Aceh for that panel, and the night before the talk, I set aside what I was going to write and just quickly wrote a paper called Haunted by Aceh. And I quote here from part of that. I left Indonesia planning to deliver a paper for this panel entitled Violence, Memory, and the Uncanny, the Paintings of Entang Wiharso. But I found myself instead haunted by Aceh. I've been working in Indonesia for 10 years. I've made only 2 short trips to Aceh, and although we expect to work more intensely there over the next several years, I'm haunted by the visual images of the utter calamity, the Hancuran tsunami, and by the stories that come forth unbidden. I was chatting with a nurse in Aceh's only mental hospital last week, talking about the patients and her role in caring for them. I asked about the tsunami and its effect on her family. She said, "Ya Pak, kami ada 26 korban dalam keluarga saya, with 26 korban in my family." I said, "Oh my God, you must miss them. Harus rindu." Ya, kami rindu selalu. We miss them, but kami berdoa, we go on, we do our work, she said, still smiling. Earlier that year in 2005, in June, when we first visited Aceh for IOM, we heard explicit ghost stories. We often hear people crying at night, calling out, we were told. Then we pray and they go away. Do they come in your dreams? I often see a woman wearing a jilbab. She is not very clear, but she comes near and then she leaves. With nearly 180,000 people dead and thousands of homes and whole communities gone, the stories of the sea rising up, the vivid memories of terror and survival, while those around perished, and the stories of loss are all unsettling, deeply moving. Many Acehnese are haunted by ghosts, and nearly all by memories. I'm haunted by stories. This almost accidental use of the term haunting, juxtaposed to a panel on the place of Freud's conceptualization of the uncanny for anthropologists, began for me what has been 20 years of reflection on and writing about the place of haunting and hauntology in anthropology. For me, this has provided new ways to think about the relationship between the individual, psychological experience, and the inner lives of societies. It allows me to raise questions, for example, about what it means to ask if Aceh is still haunted by the conflict. Apakah Aceh masih dihantui oleh yang konflik dari 20 tahun yang lalu atau tidak lagi? At a time when nearly half of the population is too young to even recall the events of the conflict. Hauntology opens on to broader questions of historical trauma and silenced memories, of what it means to us, for example, in my society, and what ways American society is still haunted by a history of slavery, of settler colonialism on the land of indigenous Americans. Or in what ways Indonesia is haunted by aspects of its national history, of colonialism, of violence of 1965, of the disappearance of students during the Orde Baru, or the violence in East Timor, or in Aceh, or in ongoing in Papua. The title of a recent book, Finding Nuts, or Humanidad. Okay, hopefully it keeps working. So the title of a recent book edited by Tias Suci from Atmajaya and Hans Bose, the historian of medicine, which is Menyelenggarakan Trauma Bangsa, Lukas Sejarah Indonesia, hidup sekarang ada suara masuk. Lukas Sejarah Indonesia dan Jalan Menuju Pemulihan Jiwa, to which Mary Jo and I contributed chapters on Aceh, captures the importance of taking on questions of haunting, of silence, history, violence, and the potential for contributing to Pemulihan Jiwa. So this talk will have two parts. The first, I want to talk about the mental health work that Mary Jo and I did in Aceh beginning in 2005. I want to talk about the mental health work that Mary Jo and I did in Aceh beginning in 2005 and carried forward for almost a decade. The peace process made a space for extraordinary levels of violence hidden away in the hills of Aceh and largely outside of international awareness to come into view. Indeed, the tsunami of December 26, 2004 opened Aceh to the rest of Indonesia and much of the world, making it impossible to keep the violence hidden, and led directly to the negotiation of the MOU. It was in this context that Mary Jo and I helped lead a series of projects, in post-conflict sub-districts of Aceh, that is up in the conflict regions, not down on the coast primarily. And this work, I think, suggests, and I think for this group working in global health here also, and in community health, suggests important roles for medical anthropologists in post-conflict settings. Second, I want to talk briefly about how my thinking and writing about hauntology evolved alongside the work we were doing in Aceh. The stories of violence that we listened to during the work provided an ongoing stimulus to think about the nature of violence, haunting, and memory. Now, less than 3 weeks ago, on August 15, I gave a keynote address to an academic conference reflecting on that peace process, exactly 20 years after the signing of the MOU. The constant surveillance by the police, the military, and intel services during the events that commemorated the 20 years of peace in Aceh is a reminder of just how sensitive these issues still are today. Former GOM members involved in the negotiations and the drafting of the MOU and the UUPA, the Pemerintah Aceh, the law establishing form of self-governance of Aceh, gathered in Diskusi Publik on the UIN campus, for instance, to discuss the extent to which the MOU has been implemented and the apparent weaknesses in the Pemerintah Aceh. International scholars were invited to discuss the Aceh peace accords in comparative terms and questions of implementation of self-governance and need to continue financial support for victims of the violence were quite present. On August 14, the Aceh Truth and Reconciliation Commission released the English language translation of their final report. And it was in this context that I thought it was important to look back, to recall what was learned about the violence and about the extent of human rights abuses that occurred during the nearly 30 years of the conflict. So just a brief reminder for those of you who are less than 30 years old and don't really remember exactly the tsunami yourself. On December 26, 2004, the Great Indian Ocean tsunami struck the coast of Aceh, the northernmost province of Sumatra, killing nearly 180,000 persons and destroying entire communities along the coast. Over 400,000 people were displaced, as more than 200 humanitarian organizations from around the world swept into Aceh. And then many began to, for the first time, take notice of the violent conflict between the forces of GOM, Gerakan Aceh Merdeka, and the Indonesian military forces. The conflict had been ongoing since GOM was launched in 1976. But in recent years, largely hidden from the international attention by the Indonesian government. That is, we were not allowed, orang dari luar negeri tak boleh pergi ke Aceh selama DOM dan selama waktu itu. The discovery of massive natural gas off the coast of Lok Sumawe was one source of tension leading to the conflict. By the early 1990s, ,1990s, 20% of ExxonMobil's global profits came from Aceh. And 10% of the national budget of Jakarta, of Indonesia, came from Aceh. And despite that fact, almost none of those funds were returned to Aceh. Public anger grew about this, and demonstrations began attempting to shut down or interrupt the production of gas, The situation was increasingly militarized, with ExxonMobil supporting the use of the TNI and the National Police Forces, the Brimo, to maintain production. GAM responded by developing guerrilla forces up in the hills of Aceh, with strong support from many villages. Anger was directed particularly at the central government of Jakarta for what was perceived as, quote, the militarization of predatory economics, the stripping of Aceh's oil and gas wealth, its forests and plantations, and even its fish and coffee, all with the support of the military forces. As any of you here know, the Acehnese have a saying, the mountain goat eats the corn, the village goat takes the beating. So, kambing kampung yang kena pukul.
Siapa kambing?
So I assume you know that, all of you know, Ario's incredibly vivid and telling documentary film. I still remember when you brought that to Harvard. And the people from GOM said, oh yeah, we stole a copy of that and we used it for raising funds. Throughout the decades of the conflict, GOM waged battles against the TNI from remote villages in the interior hills of the province. The TNI turned their frustration into violence against villagers, destroying public buildings and personal homes, torturing individuals and communities as part of systematic interrogation to try to find information about the location of GOM, with a commitment to destroy GOM, as they said, at its roots. By the end of the conflict, over 35,000 Acehnese had been killed, whole villages had been displaced, and a large part of the population of high conflict sub-districts had suffered terrible traumatic violence. The tsunami brought enormous sympathy for the suffering of the people of Aceh, both around Indonesia and globally, and an influx of international, intergovernmental, and Indonesian humanitarian organizations. I remember coming in January and then again in June, when Metro TV was playing constantly, constantly playing this whole line about Indonesia menangis untuk Aceh. Itu yang selalu ada during that time. Given the enormous support for Aceh, ongoing military action could hardly be continued. The fact that the tsunami also led to the deaths of over 25,000 TNE, because the base buses were largely on the coast. Together, these factors helped renew efforts at a new MOU, and a peace agreement was signed on August 15. Now, the tsunami led to a broad awareness of trauma. Okay.
Mungkin Mas Arif yang
Okay, next slide.
dibawa gitu lah.
Yeah, tapi saya harus lihat itu.
Pak Byron bisa say next saja dan
Oh, I know, but I need to be able to see it
Yeah.
also. So the tsunami led to a broad awareness of trauma experienced by the Acehnese people and the need for mental health or psychosocial responses. The most immediate response came from the Directorate of Mental Health in the Ministry of Health in Jakarta, in collaboration with WHO. Let me just say it, shorten this. They came into Aceh. They had a whole program of JMHN, community mental health nursing, which they trained, in which they had a very Jakarta model of training for existing nurses in each puskesmas, which then became a kind of national model for thinking about how do you have community-based mental health services. So that was of great importance, called the Aceh model. But it was also strange because their entire focus was on psychosis, on psychotic illness, at a time when the issues were really trauma, and which they were not trained to focus on at all. So while many of the more than 200 humanitarian agencies that responded to the tsunami had psychosocial programs, as they call them, the most systematic development of mental health response was led by the Indonesian office of the International Organization for Migration, IOM. IOM played a formal role supporting displaced persons during the conflict and agreed to provide livelihood support for former combatants as part of the MOU. In August of 2005, Steve Cook, the director of IOM Indonesia in Jakarta, agreed to contract with Harvard for Mary Jo and me to serve as consultants on a program of mental health services up in the hills in the sub-districts most affected by the conflict. In October of 2005, Nanette Modis of IOM proposed to the Canadian Department of Foreign Affairs that part of the funds provided to support IOM's post-conflict medical activities in Aceh should support a psychosocial needs assessment, or PNA, that focused in 3 high conflict districts out of PD Byron and Aceh Utara. At IOM's request, Prof. Mary Jo and I agreed to assemble a team and direct the project. Jesse Grayman, then our Ph.D. student in anthropology at Harvard and working for IOM, he's now Associate Professor of Development Studies at the University of New Zealand, agreed to coordinate and manage the project beginning in December 2005. Operating within the constraints of donor time, as we've written about, Jesse and I visited Banda Aceh and Sigli in November. That's what I described in the opening. And by early January, our teams designed the project, constructed quantitative and qualitative interview forms, translated, trained a group of team leaders and interviewers from Shakwala, sampled high conflict sub-districts in each of these 3 districts to identify target villages for a survey. The teams were led in the field the teams were actually into the field already by 2006, February. In each village, adults were randomly selected for an interview. So we go into the Manasa like this. Then we would go off to let's see. They would sit down, go through the households, identify randomly households, then go into the households and do interviews. They would also select randomly adults to do qualitative interviews with, and did it in this fashion because even while we were paying something like something like that per interview, they became very upset as to how it would be chosen. So PNA had a total sample for the quantitative data of 596 adults and 75 persons for qualitative interviews. By March, data were entered and analysis begun. By June, drafts of reports were written, and by September, a final glossy report was published by IOM with a strong letter of support. They required it before they would publish it because the data were quite scary for them, from the Minister of Health. Given the impact of the PNA report, The World Bank agreed to extend the research into high conflict sub-districts of the 11 additional districts of Aceh. Primary research following the same methods was conducted in July 2006, and the final report of the second PNA research was published in June 2007. So that's just some pictures from going off and doing that. Now, it's important to recall what Aceh was like in February of 2006, when we did the first PNA research. Major cities and much of the coastline was still destroyed, covered in the wreckage of the tsunami, and the ghosts of the dead and missing haunted the countryside. Up in the hills, the burned out shells of schools and homes were a reminder of just how near the conflict really remained. Many villages were devoid of chickens and goats and cows that are part of the usual landscape in rural Aceh, taken by the military forces of the conflict. Military posts were still present in the countryside, often placed near primary healthcare centers so they could monitor for potential combatants seeking emergency medical care. The peace process was just beginning to be implemented. Former combatants were very slowly making appearances in the towns and villages. There remained a deep sense of uncertainty that the conflict would not return, and the experience of the violence, traumatic memories of the interrogations, torture, and killings were still very fresh wounds. Our young student interviewers often would go out with us in the morning going in a kind of class, and they would be laughing and joking as they went out. They returned in the evenings, often largely silent, deep in thought about the stories they'd heard during the day. The quantitative findings of the PNA bore witness to the horrific violence experienced by civilian communities assumed to be the source of ground combatants. In the 3 districts in which we conducted the initial survey, for example, and these are just the kinds of figures that were reported, 78% of adults surveyed reported having experienced conflict, 78%. 39% described themselves as having been beaten. 18% reported being tortured. 8% of women reported having their husband killed. 5% reported one of their children had been killed. 41% reported having a member of the family or a friend who was killed. I still remember watching the results of the initial data runs come out of the computer, and a kind of shock and horror. Findings reflected the stories that we had heard, but somehow I think I held on to hope that the stories that we heard were extreme examples rather than the norm, rather than extremely common. Rates for certain kind of traumatic experiences varied by gender and age, as well as by district. And you just get a sense here, for instance, of how much higher, like things like torture were in Byron and Aceh than they were in PD. And for instance, 56% of men and quote, only 20% of women reported being 25% of men and 11% of women reported being tortured, 65% of men and 45% of women being forced to watch physical violence against someone else. In Byron and Aceh, 85% of adults reported experiencing combat, compared with 66% in PD, and in Byron, 67% of the men reported age 17 to 29 reported head trauma or suffocation, actually of exactly the kind that were enacted in Ario's film that he showed. So these are just sorts of the kind of data that came out. This is, I think, a slide that was very shocking to people to see that young men have suffered so much head trauma. And a lot of them have been suffocated. So that there was, so that there were a lot of long-lasting brain damage to young men in these areas. And this was a slide that just says, with this kind of quantitative analysis that we were able to do, how much that if you had had 11 or more, so those events that I described, of course, many people were compounded. Many of them had lots of the events. And if you had had at least 11 of those, you were 40 times more likely to suffer from PTSD than if you had 0 to 3 of those events. So it was just that the amount of trauma led directly to the amount of mental health problems. And that was eventually published in these kind of reports. Well, the statistics in these reports were critical for understanding levels of violence. They do not capture the real ongoing sense of terror and suffering experienced by the villagers, even after the MOU and cessation of overt violence. For many, the use of the word teringa, not the word mengingat. So you would ask people, and they would say, "Yeah, teringa, the memories come to me. They come unbidden to me. And suddenly I feel tremendously anxious." And they would see once again. It's not like they were trying to remember. They were trying not to remember the teringa. And at night, the memories would come to them about horrifying events. Memories would come to them unbidden, often at the same time or in the same place every day. They would relive the violence they had experienced or witnessed as though it were happening again. At the same time, the same memories would come as dreams or nightmares. They would awake, not be able to sleep for the rest of the night. I remember stories from people, and we said, "Oh my God, that sounds like it happened last week." But the MOU is already 2 years old when we were not in this, but this was in a later intervention program. And yeah, the clinician said it actually happened 10 years ago. And they were talking about them as still being very present. In one village in Aceh, our interviewers left in such shock that Jesse Brayman, coordinating the project, arranged for IOM to send a mobile mental health team into the village, so that on February 15, 2006, we joined a group of Achenese doctors and nurses, including a deeply committed IOM psychiatrist and a guide who was a former GOM member, in a caravan of four-wheel drive vehicles marked with the blue and white symbols of IOM up into the hills of North Aceh. We stopped at so we would go by on driving up the hills, you would see this. We stopped in a shabby village center with a few nearly empty shops. People had begun to gather expecting our visit. We were greeted with coffee, cigarettes, and small talk, which gradually turned more somber as people began to refer to the events of the conflict. And after a short time, we walked to the Manasa, where we were met by a tall, thin man in his 40s, wailing loudly as friends tried to support him. The doctor proceeded up the steps of the Manasa to a large open room where the two sat facing each other, surrounded by a growing crowd of villagers, and opened this trauma clinic. My scribbled handwritten notes report the following. In April of 2004, men in black shirts came at 4 a.m., accused this man of being a spy for GOM. They beat him, bound his hands and legs, tied a plastic bag over his head, suffocated him, hung him on a pole, they said, like a goat, beat him many times, smashed his head, left him for dead. The villagers found him and released him still alive. But since then, he can't sleep, he can't work, he can't take care of his family. and he cries constantly. The doctor took control, grabbed his hand, and said a prayer with him, calmed him, took his blood pressure, gave him an injection of a sedative, and soon he was sleeping quietly. Thunder and lightning crashed outside as one by one villagers came forward to tell their stories to the doctor. Mary Jo and I joined, chatting with those surrounding the doctor. I remember I began a conversation with a man sitting quietly, smiling. I said, "How are you?" He asked. I asked. His eyes began to water. They came and took everything from his house. The villagers were forced to leave, and when he came back, his house was empty. Everything was gone. The chickens were gone. Everything was gone. His dishes were gone. He feels sad. He cries easily. He often sleeps at 9. Then he wakes up at midnight. He can't sleep. He has little appetite. He was beaten for a long time. He couldn't work. He's a little better now, but he still has pain in his body. He really looks severely depressed. A woman tells her story to the doctor. Her husband was taken in 1990, cut open and killed while she and her children were forced to watch. She has pain in her heart. She feels sad, easily frightened. They cut off his ear and put it in the manas. She doesn't know where his head was from. She suddenly makes a joke in the mood in the room. Everyone, of course, has already heard these stories. This is kind of in a group, but everyone knows these stories already. And so the stories went on for nearly 5 hours until the doctor had had all he could take, asked the trainer from the local soccer team to massage him. We all relaxed for a bit and then took our leave. Now, these were, of course, only a part of the stories we heard. Whenever Mary Jo and I joined the teams, but whenever Mary Jo and I joined the teams, the women wanted to talk to Mary Jo, not to me. Unlike the NGO reports that use the term women and children to describe the most vulnerable to violence and the most likely victims of violence, the women often told stories of great heroism. They would band together to ensure no woman was left alone with a soldier to prevent sexual violence. One Javanese woman who was married to an Achenese, lived in the village, reported how she had stood between her husband and the military and shouted in Javanese, "If you want to kill him, you have to kill me first." And women described going in groups, like getting in a truck, going down to the police station and demand that their sons and husbands were free. Indeed, these women often represented themselves as belonging to a long tradition of Aceh warrior women rather than as victims. I have some pictures. This I'll show as, I guess that's a little, I'll put the slides a little later. So for Mary Jo and me, this was the start of a long and deep involvement in responding to those who told us their stories. We took the rather spontaneous trauma clinic as a model for the development of mental health outreach teams organized by IOM, staffed by young Achenese doctors and nurses, and funded by diverse donors from the World Bank and elsewhere. Unlike the Ministry of Health model, which focused largely on psychotic illness, IOM teams conducted outreach into villages, identifying persons with mental health problems, often described simply as trauma, making psychiatric diagnosis, providing medications, home visits, and simple counseling. Each village was visited weekly at the beginning, then monthly for nearly a year before referring those who needed continuing care back to the Puskas Mas. So as you see, there were 2 phases of this work. These teams treated over 2,000 persons in 75 villages in 2 phases. A pilot project in 25 villages begun in 2006, Then an extension to 50 more villages begun in 2007. For those in phase 2, a careful outcome study was conducted with 1,122 persons who met criteria for mental health problems, documenting diagnoses, treatment, and rates of recovery. Notably, only 3%. So this is just to give you a quick picture of like how we would go into villages, what it would look like. People who would come at the initial, before then people were identified and mostly the teams went into their homes. This was in the initial stages of identifying people, then given medications. And these were the samples of people in the phase 2 part that we did follow up with. And you can see the remarkable thing is over a period of 2 years to have only 5% dropout. For quantitative work is pretty damn unusual. And it looked more like a primary care, that is, it wasn't just the men who had the highest that came. This is like primary care settings where 68% for women and 32% men. And it's important to say that we only treated 11% of the adults, only 6% of the total population. So this was not a case of pathologizing whole villages and trying to treat whole villages for trauma. Notably, only 3% of those who were diagnosed with a psychotic or organic disorder. For 97%, diagnoses were anxiety disorders, PTSD, somatoform disorders, and depression. The outcome study, along with the longitudinal case studies that Mary Jo and I have conducted, clearly demonstrates, this just shows you people were treated largely with medications, antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications. The outcome study, along with longitudinal case studies, demonstrated people got better. At the end of the treatment phase, 1% reported their symptoms gotten worse, 16% that their symptoms remained the same, and 83% that their symptoms had improved from before to after treatment, whereas those treated reported being able to work. So also ability to work got better. Whereas the treated reported only being able to work on an average of 11 hours per week prior to the intervention. A lot of this was, of course, during the time that was still at the end of the conflict when people were not able to go into the field. But they reported an average of 41 hours at the end of the treatment. So I would just say the treatment also not only affects symptoms, but it also leads to social recovery and people's ability to work. Just a note about this, most NGOs report studies of effectiveness by just how many people did they treat. Very few people actually said how many people got better. And actually doing work that shows, quote, effectiveness of community-based interventions is really, I think, very, very critical. In our cases, we watched as persons were finally able to put their memories into the past instead of re-experiencing them in the present. They no longer experienced the terror daily. They began to sleep. They no longer found it necessary to talk about what had happened. They were able to re-engage with friends and family members, to participate in community activities, to return to religious rituals, to return to Sola, and eventually to reclaim their lives. Now, reclaiming their lives for many was difficult, not only owing to mental health problems, but because economic life in these conflict-affected villages were massively disrupted by the conflict. Our PNA1 study, the first study, showed 85% of adults described difficulties in simply providing for their families, 90% difficulty in finding work, 71% difficulty in restarting their livelihoods post-conflict, and 72% had concerns simply about food stability, and 59% about shelter. After nearly 30 years of conflict, wreaking havoc on local economies, preventing villagers from working their land, killing or abducting their animals, destroying trade networks, wrecking houses, and preventing young people from entering into the labor economy, life was difficult. Our work with IOM was personally gratifying. We spent months listening to stories of violence that continued to haunt those who lived through the conflict as well as us. We fought to have IOM initiate a treatment program to care for those who shared their stories and wrote proposals to develop funding. We worked closely with the treatment teams, carried out formal evaluations, wrote reports. We had the unusual opportunity for anthropologists to help lead a project, listening to stories of trauma, knowing that those with whom we talked were getting good care, and watching many people recover. We've continued to advocate for a model of mental health care that includes outreach into communities, particularly in settings of violence. And let me add one note. In my talk about Aceh, I argued that the peace process that is ending the conflict was the single most important mental health intervention in Aceh. On the other hand, I made a case that mental health care interventions that reduce the acuity of traumatic memory are critical contributors to the peace process as well. And finally, speaking for anthropologists, let me just say that I believe this is the kind of work that medical and psychological anthropologists should be involved in. I support this kind of very direct work. Now, in a way, this is enough, and I can stop here, but I'm going to turn to the second half of this paper, which is to talk about content. Although we were not constantly present with the teams, listening to stories of violence, as well as stories of how people responded, was a powerful experience for Mary Jo and me. One of the responses of Mary Jo to our time in the field was to develop a respect for the power of Aceh's women. She came to reject NGO talk about women and children as particularly vulnerable victims, as though women are children. My own time listening to the stories of violence and torture, so these are kind of Mary Jo out in the field and what was coming out in the newspapers at the time, remembering the history of women heroes in Aceh historically. And also, as you can see, they were very involved in activities at that period of time. My own time listening to stories of violence and torture led me to think more deeply about what's the nature of the human subject and subjectivity. What theory of the subject do we need to understand not only how people can become torturers, but how people can enact torture with such apparent pleasure? Could that be possible for each of us? Here, Freud's work on the deep relationship between eros and thanatos, between pleasure, passion, attachment, eros, on the one hand, and aggression, to death instinct, he called it, but aggression on the other. And the fact that you don't have one without the other is suddenly felt relevant. Psychoanalytic writing about the nature of the subject and subjectivity, about how much our personal motives are unavailable to us for introspection, and about the deep complexity of the human subject seemed more relevant to me than ever. And it was in this context that I began talking more and more directly, thinking more and more about theorizing being haunted. Now, as I began examining haunting as an analytic category, I quickly found my way into an extremely large body of literature writing in literary and cultural studies. that grew out of the publication of Jacques Derrida's Spectres of Mars, published in French in '93 and English in 1994. Derrida's provocative work juxtaposes the term ontology and the word hauntology, which in French both are ontology and ontology. They sound the same. But no, it's and argues for the importance of ghosts and of haunting, of learning to live with that which is never, as he writes, is never present as such. We have to learn to live with that which is not present as such. So provocative was Derrida's work that in the following decade it led to a very large literature in cultural studies. Examples of these writings were drawn together in an edited volume published in 2013, titled The Spectralities Reader, Ghost and Haunting in Contemporary Cultural Theory, published 2013. The collection organizes recent writing in the field under the headings of spectral politics, spectral media. By the way, it was very interesting to get into Derrida because he also argues that increased forms of media are going to increase forms of ghosts, increase forms of spectrality. The spectrality is inherent in new forms of media. Spectral subjectivities, spectral places, and haunted historiographies. And Avery Gordon's book, Ghostly Matters, Haunting and the Sociological Imagination, is also a critical part of this body of work. What was immediately interesting in coming to terms with this large body of writing was to ask, where's anthropology? And where had it been during this time? How was it that anthropology seems to have little engagement with this whole body of work that between 1994 and 2013 was everywhere in studies? So why is this also not been important, even particularly, I believe, in psychological anthropology? So this set me off on a line of reading and writing that followed in parallel with the work we were doing at Aceh. It provided a frame for thinking about a series of experiences we lived through in Aceh. Thank you, Mr. Water. Yeah. It provided a frame for thinking about a series of experiences we'd actually have lived in since coming to Indonesia in 1996. Now, in 2020, I edited the special issue of the journal Ethos, that's the Journal of the American Psychological Association, of the Society of Psychological Anthropology. My piece there, entitled Hauntology, Theorizing the Spectral in Psychological Anthropology, began with a passage from Eka Kurniawan's novel, translated into English as Beauty is a Wound. And it goes like this, the first paragraph. One afternoon, on a weekend in March, Devi Ayu rose from her grave after being dead for 21 years. A shepherd boy awakened from his nap under a banyan tree, peed in his shorts and screamed, and his 4 sheep ran off haphazardly in between stones and wooden grave markers, as if a tiger had been thrown into their midst. Devi Ayu had passed away at age 52, rose again after being dead for 21 years, and from that point forward, nobody knew how to establish her exact age. And it tells you something about ghosts that come back. And one not knowing what their age is when it happened, is having that strange sense of being out of time, right? Kurniawan's sweeping epic novel of Indonesia whimsically combines history, legend, humor, romance, and critical political analysis. The stories carried by Dewi Ayu, the beautiful Javanese woman whose life and career as a prostitute spanned critical decades of Indonesia's transformation from colonialism, Japanese rule, the rowdy struggle for independence, to the mass killings of 65 and the subsequent despotic rule of President Suharto. It is from her sometimes cynical, sometimes bemused observations of men and their altogether human participation in the making of history that the story is told. For the purposes of this paper, I wrote, it is her sudden rising from the grave in the opening paragraph of the book, and a return as a ghost whose age nobody knew exactly how to calculate, that raises questions for anthropologists. Why do ghosts appear when they do? And where they do? Why at some times, in some moments, do they step out of their graves and re-enter history? Sometimes in large numbers, in ways that trouble the living, even though no one, quote, knows how to calculate their age. Why at some moments in history, and in particular locales, is there an upwelling of the spectrum, of ghosts and the ghostly who haunt the present, or of unexpected outbreaks of witchcraft and witch hunts, think Jim Seaver here, right? Or of forms of mad violence that seem to have spectral qualities, ghostly qualities. How are such hauntings experienced? And how do individuals and societies respond to such outbreaks, to the appearance of ghosts and fear associated with hauntings? How can we theorize and investigate those moments when a society is shaken by the appearance of ghosts, or when a society seems able, to tolerate their presence? And how can we understand the repressive responses that often take place then? I just have in my mind as I think about this, how the ghosts of slavery were able to appear in America during Obama, and how the society responded with Donald Trump and with the outpouring of Nazism and racism that followed after that appearance in society. So I went on in that paper to make 4 propositions for the place of ontology and psychological anthropology, which I can only list here and not go through, but let me just say them. The hauntology requires that we address the complex processes through which traumatic dimensions, contested historical experience are simultaneously kept hidden from view and made visible. And always remember, going back and reporting about Aceh to people at Ugea, and people coming up and saying, we have no idea that. And on the other hand, knowing that it was there, people actually knew and didn't know. Mary Jo and I knew and didn't know. We, in a way, were focused on jokes. We went on with our lives. People know and don't know, which is at the heart of being haunted in all kinds of ways. We can discuss that. Second, any account of the way historical experience is simultaneously kept hidden and made visible requires that we address the complex interactions between individual psychological experience and social processes. And such analyses require the conception of, quote, the bard's self in its relation to haunting. Here I'm thinking of French psychoanalytics, French psychodynamic theory, the notion that of a bard's self, a self that we have little access to our own, to parts of our own selves. Third, I return to the questions of why ghosts appear when they do, and what kind of responses there are to them. And I suggest that this actually remains a major area for our work, our thinking, and for theorizing in psychological anthropology. And finally, I concluded with a few words about the place of hauntology in ethics, or what I call ontological ethics. A question of life. So those of us in the United States at this moment are haunted by the fact that our money is being used to purchase weapons for the Israelis to bomb the hell out of Gaza. And we have to live with that. That's how we live, knowing that. And how can we actually live, how can we consider ourselves moral persons, knowing that we are ourselves haunted? What kind of a quote, ethics comes out of our thinking in those terms? Obviously, taking up these issues is a matter for another lecture, a whole course. Here, I just want to make a few final comments. First, as we were publishing this piece, the editors of the annual review of Anthropology asked if I would undertake a review of the anthropological literature on haunting and hauntology. I said I would try to do so, but I was unsure if there was enough anthropological writing to make up an entire review. As I said, there was a kind of apparent ignoring of this thing. The editor told me she also wasn't certain there would be enough that I would find. However, as two of my younger colleagues and I began searching the literature systematically, we were able to locate nearly 450 books and articles scattered all over anthropology, in which issues of haunting and hauntology were explicit, mostly with references to Derrida directly. As we were preparing the review, an issue of the 2021 Anthropology News, which comes out from the AAA, had a special collection of short essays, all addressing the topic ghosts and haunting. This year's American Anthropology Association annual meetings to be held in New Orleans in November is organized around the theme ghosts. In this latter sense, clearly anthropology has now discovered hauntology. What that means for our field then became the topic for the annual review piece that I love. Second, this work actually translates nicely into Bahasa Indonesia. As I speak about this work in Bahasa Indonesia, the term haunted by simply translates as dihantui, oleh, yeah? With its root hantu, ghost. Derrida's Spectres of Marx is translated, what? As hantu ghost Marx, right? And I suggested elsewhere that we translate hauntology for Indonesia as hantuologi, this science of ghosts, which itself is a nice kind of idea, with all of the complexity that signals. Third, an anthropological hauntology raises a series of questions quite different from those of literary and cultural studies. Literary scholars reject any relevance of the ontological status of ghosts, or as they write, you don't need to believe in ghosts to write about haunting. For anthropologists, writing from inside a society in which ghosts and haunting are as present as chairs and tables, asking questions about why a ghost appear when they do, about the ways in which a society is haunted by ghosts of its past and by its futures, as Derrida writes, raises intriguing questions not relevant for classical cultural studies. I would say that anthropology right now is caught between an ontological term on the one hand and a hauntological term or spectral term on the other. It's not surprising, I think, that a large body of ethnographic writing about ghosts is linked to Southeast Asia, to Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, where ghosts of the past are always in conversation with ghosts of the present, where haunted spaces exist in those subjunctive spaces between play and terror. It is interesting that in Aceh, turning a notorious site of rape and torture, as some of you will know, Gedung, and house of torture into a monument has done very little to erase the past or to settle the ghosts that still inhabit that area. Let me just show you. So these are just a few photos from recently in Art Joe that give a sense that these things are being thought about a lot by artists these days. This was this quite interesting thing in which there were photos of people under, so this is Trisakti, one of the women being held by the police during Trisakti, and then what she looks like now. And this was a picture of this woman and a young son looking for food out of the beach of Aceh, and then what they're like now. And it seems impossible to end this paper without making note of the current moment in Jakarta and around Indonesia, in which ghosts of the past are present everywhere. Anytime we hear the language of Anak, peace, juxtaposed to that of order, we are in a world that has appeared over and again throughout the past 60 years, one that resists efforts at reformasi and wants the future as much as it wants the past. Finally, to return to the title of the recent book edited by T.S. Suchi and Hans Pols, I remain committed to the notion of medical and psychological anthropologists, along with activists, have an important role in menyelenggarakan trauma bangsa, in attending openly, along with activists, to the luka sejarah, to documenting historical violence. I also believe that as anthropologists, we have a serious opportunity to contribute to the Jalan Menuju Pemulihan Jiwa. For mental health specialists in Aceh, this means helping those who continue to relive trauma from the conflict to somehow let go of the past and re-enter the present. But this raises broader questions about what it takes for a society to deal with contested past, when many are neither ready for acknowledgement nor forms of therapeutic grieving, unwilling to put the ghost to rest. Again, to take this up seriously is another talk. Ultimately, Derrida, however, reminds us that the ghosts of violence cannot be erased. To learn to live with ghosts, he writes, and to live more justly. This is the difficult and often troubling task at hand. Engaging this learning requires, as Derrida writes, a politics of memory, of inheritance, and of generations. One task of scholars and activists alike, thus, is to participate in this process of learning to live with ghosts more justly. Thank you. Okay.
Silakan. Okay,
Yeah, I think I think Byron already gave the lecture for 1 hour, and then I think there's two parts of the paper, right? First is how Byron and Bu Mary Jo actually experiences to do the mental health intervention in Aceh, and then to show how medical anthropology and psychological anthropology also can have our impact to the people. And the second is more on the theorizing the hauntology in anthropology. I think we now can start the discussion. Yeah. So, I will take maybe 3 questions first from this audience. Maybe later I will give also opportunity to the those who are attending in the Zoom. Yeah. Silakan. Mas Tony, Mas Haji, ada lagi? One, oke, satu lagi. Oke, silakan. Mungkin sebut nama and then, ya.
Langsung aja.
Langsung. Ya.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor. Very good. This topic is very interesting, very difficult also for me, especially about the psychological one, psychoanalysis one. I just want to know what is there is a term in English, monster and ghost, haunted by monster and haunted by ghost. Do you think we have to distinguish these two terms? Culturally, I don't know, in English culture. And it is relevant or not for Indonesian culture or Aceh, for instance. It is one. The other one is, I have three questions. About how to heal the trauma memory. People usually, in order to understand how to heal it, sometimes they just to, how do you call it, reflect back about the past. And usually the past, there is two things, two layers of the past. The trauma past, but also the past that they make it more to glorify the past, make it a more romantic. Sometimes the glory past never exists, also in the past. The past in past itself is never exists. Just the thing to try to glorify that. Perhaps Majapahit or whatever, golden age, something like that. If you try to heal the trauma, usually people try to go back to the glorious one, but in reality, it never exists. So it is like a kind of, there is a hope for the future, but the hope is always defer hope, always differ, always, how do you call it, tertunda, never realized. So it is one of problem how to heal the trauma. It is one thing that I have in mind. And the other one is about your experience in Aceh. What is the most effective method, perhaps, to help people to relive the present as it is, and they can survive in that past memory. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much.
So,
Yeah.
Ahmad,
Yeah.
should I answer?
Fajri Aji.
You will answer directly.
Okay,
Okay.
sir, so the first thing, as I mentioned,
Yeah.
you say you have difficulty with psychoanalysis. What I would just say is that in the history of American anthropology,
Yes.
psychoanalysis is always present.
I remember Ganadat Obeye Sakere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas in British anthropology, it's been ruled out forever.
I think Evan Pritchett, right? Evan Pritchett. Yeah, yes.
Right. So
Yeah.
it's there, but it was always outside of the mainstream.
Yeah.
And as I said, for European anthropologists, they're almost embarrassed to include psychological anthropology as central to the field. So to your questions about ghosts and monsters, of course, there are many different kinds of ghosts.
Mm.
Yeah. And some of the ghosts are good. People would also describe not only having dreams of terror, they were also a very comforting dreams where their husband would disappear, would come and visit them, you tell them what the future should be, what they should do, would comfort them. There are many different kinds of ghosts, and I think the term ghost for Americans is a very generic. In Indonesia, it's very specific. Lots of different kinds of ghosts.
Yeah.
Jawa, lots of different ghosts in each society you go to. So the term hantu itself, of course, is a very generic term. It doesn't describe the differences you're talking about. The issue of how to resolve trauma, of course, historical trauma is a huge topic and a very fascinating. Some of you will know Mary Steedley's book, Hanging Without a Rope, my colleague before she died at Harvard, who worked with Karobata people.
Yeah.
And she describes, and I kept expecting, because she wrote about films later, and about spooky novels, spooky films, that she would have used the term haunting. And we were asked to write for the journal Indonesia a little memory piece, and I did it under the title, and I did it under the title of haunting. And then I looked, and she now didn't use the word. And so I looked through that book, and she describes one story of a woman, a Batak woman, who wants to become Christian, and she knows once she becomes Christian, she can't have a seance. Well, her husband disappeared. Her husband, who was communist, disappeared in 1965, and she always wondered where he was. And so they are arranging a seance to call him back and find out what happened to him. And everybody's wondering, is he going to come back and rage against them, tell them how terrible they've been, how they've all abandoned the cause? He comes back first of all, and he quietly describes where he was killed. He talks fondly to his children, to his wife. He tells the children they should take better care of their mother. And then, very interestingly, he goes into a funeral march before he leaves. And what I take this, and it is only then that Mary Speedley uses the term haunting, talk about how Indonesia is still haunted by the blood that ran through the rivers in 1965, etc., in the context of that story. And to me, the story says that only with a process of grieving can the past be dealt with. America's not ready. We've just found out that America's not ready to grieve about slavery. It's not ready to grieve about its past. Donald Trump wants to forget it exists. He doesn't want the Smithsonian Museum to make white people feel uncomfortable. America's not ready to grieve about its history. And, there are many ways in which parts of Indonesian government are not ready to grieve about what happened in other parts of society. And so part of my answer is not to go back to golden ages. That past trauma can only be actually dealt with successfully by a kind of grief process. And that's very hard to have. Very hard to have. Let's see, what was the last?
There for future. A hope about the future, but it's always like.
Yeah,
And-
so, I think one of the things that's really important about Derrida's work is he talks about being haunted, not just by the past, haunted by roads not taken.
Yes.
And he talks about haunted by the future. I don't know how true it is in Indonesia. Many young Americans don't want to have kids.
Yeah.
They're worried about the future. They're haunted by the future. And I just think that, that haunting is present everywhere. The Derrida is haunting between between categories. Haunting is present in our histories as part of us. But haunting is also about the future and about our constant imagining of futures. So,
But never come.
but never come. But
The third question.
Yeah, this-
Okay, berikutnya.
Thank you, Byron. That's a terrific talk. I really enjoyed it. I guess I'm trying to think out loud here, so excuse me. I'm not making any coherent comments, formulating a coherent question. You said a couple of times in which anthropological haunting or hauntology is quite new in a way in anthropology. But I guess my question has to do with how do we think about this new emerging literature of hauntology, as you yourself have tried to envisage it, with older anthropological literature in which metahumans, ghosts, ancestral spirits, etc., are already presupposed as being part and parcel of any social framework and any ethical and moral framework. In other words, when we compare the literature on hauntology and say, for example, all the works of Nuer and Uganda, name you, then we will see a much more complicated picture of our relationship to ghosts, of human relationship to ghosts, to ancestral spirits, forms of obligation, reciprocity, sacrifice, relationship between gods and kings, and so on and so forth, in a way that anthropologists have been talking about this in a much more nuanced and complex ways than that which is presupposed by one modality of that relationship, which is hauntology. So my question becomes then, okay, what is it that is so specific about thinking about ghosts and spirits and gods and the past as a form in terms of haunting? What does that tell us about how we think about time and temporality? Say, when we say that the past is haunting us, that means we are already relegating that past to the past. Well, in many cultures and in many human civilizations, the past is never past, and people do not want the past. I mean, people, try to always make the past present. And also, what does that tell us about our own presupposition of what the subject is, and about and the agency of all this non-human actors or the past is the only form of agency that we can think of is only in terms of haunting, which is basically reducing their agency to specters, to spectral presence, to memory, to a derived trace, in a way. So I'm just trying to think about what you're proposing here in relations to a broader forms of relationalities, reciprocity, forms of obligation that anthropologists have been talking about for a long time. So I hope I'm making
So what I would say is, like, I hope my talk provokes exactly that, that set of reflections. So those are good questions to ask. The one thing that I would say is partly, I do speak as an American psychological anthropologist. You can hear that in my voice, right? And that so much of the old literature about ghosts was really in British anthropology and from Africa. And it just has as often is absent assumptions about the psychology of experience. And if you look at my friends like Jean and John Komarov, who still also write about South Africa, they're still very British. Max Gluckman, type anthropologist, is still some version of functionalism, and it's absent the psychology. And so to me, the question is, how do you deal with that old material in a way that isn't absent of psychology? How do you make it part of the complexity of psychological life? How do you actually then get into trying to talk about how do you actually use the term subjectivity and psychological experience to talk about society without reifying society, right? Talk about historical memory. What is that? Is that just individuals writ large? Is that, in what way is there then a complex process between hiding and remembering? And so part of the reason for the title of like hidden violence, it's a very present topic. And partly the reason I put this book up here to look, the book by this book on Menyelenggarakan trauma bangsa is because it's really says we have to constantly be reminded to not hide away the violence that the society would rather not think, would rather like relegate to invisibility. And what is the psychological process involved in remembering? And why is it that remembering, so you read some of this literature, you read Avery Gordon, and it feels as though, oh, if you could only speak the truth about the past, then things will get better. I always think about when Bush Stewart was president, he tried to acknowledge what happened and the role of his, of MOU in 1965. And it provoked an enormous Islamic from people like from Mohammedia, for instance, against him. And it like almost led to re-emergence in claims of communism. And so any attempt to resolve those issues, absent genuine willingness to grieve the past, I think, produces this almost kind of psychological response to it. I don't know if this, I just would say those are great questions. And I think the older kind of literature didn't lead you to ask the kinds of questions we're talking about.
Excuse me, Professor Byron. Do you incorporate art and music for your?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, I'm totally convinced that in a place like Jokta, my artist friends talk openly about these issues all the time. And my academic friends, many of them don't want to talk about it. Now, I work with psychologists, as opposed to anthropologists a lot. And I'm not talking mostly about sociotypes, but there still is a kind of openness to discussing these issues in among artists. My artist friends are like the most open, critical intellectuals that I know. And I think back about his name, the monologuist from Georgia, who did a monologue right after the fall of Suharto called Maya Young Korban. And it was a monologue in which he talked about being in a grave and about how all of the bodies were starting to come in, about having a conversation with the ghosts of those who had died. Was very openly talking about the disappearances of students, etc. It was like the whole of Joseph's community turned out for it. But he was the one who could speak over them. He's the same guy who said, I don't need to give monologues about Bush Stewart. He already makes fun of himself, so we don't need to do it for him. But he was this wonderful character that. So this happens in drama. This happens throughout. I just think the whole topic of art joke this year had a lot to do with remembering the past and with violence, etc. So yeah, I think if you want to find often where this is actually going on, you go to activists, you go to artists.
Nanti
Zoom ada yang tadi
Iya, tapi ini dulu tadi yang ketiga. Yang masih ini.
mau tahu nama.
Nanti balik sini kita pindah ke Zoom.
So Pak Kenny,
Yang lain dulu.
Yang lain.
Pagi Pak Byron dan kawan-kawan semua. My name is Rahadian. I used to study history Department of History across the street. And last year I graduated from the master program in Manchester, UK, in the Department of History of Science. I have two questions. I want to drag you back to your research on Aceh. So I wonder if you also interview the returning of the Aceh diaspora, the people who came back to Aceh after the conflict ended, and what kind of experience, if so, what kind of experiences that you draw from your interview with them, and how it's different with your with the interview that you did with the people who were there when the conflict happened. I asked that because my grandma, she was Achenese. She grew up in Takengon, but I was too young to talk about the conflict with her, and she never like bring it up to the family. And also the second question is, I read that you also like do some research in Turkey, and also in Ireland. So what kind of like, how do you put your research on Aceh with those two other research? Like, do you find any interesting like comparison, like similarities, or any other like interesting conclusions about them all? I guess that's all. Thank you.
So the first answer is I haven't done any real interviewing with that group of people. IOM was very involved first in the release of political prisoners and providing packages for them when they returned. It was also, they were very involved in the process of doing what they called livelihood support for Pasca combatant, for former combatants who returned to villages. And so I know something about that process, but you know, I take one small line of what you said, which is that your grandma didn't talk much about what was going on there. And to be a reminder that we all live in generations in which we now wish we had asked our parents and our grandparents about all kinds of things that they didn't talk about. And that one very important part of haunting is silence. That actually, so I added a kind of afterward to a special issue that anthropologists have done on silences. Eventually now I think first was in a journal, I think it's now out as a book, on the anthropology of silence. And one of the examples was from Jewish families in Israel, in which young people had never heard stories about the Holocaust from their parents and grandparents. They refused to talk about it. And that then raises all kinds of questions itself about the intergenerational transmission through secrets, through silence, how trauma gets passed along. And so the answer is kind of it's a takeoff on your question rather than a direct answer to it. Our work has we've now really broadly done 3 bodies of work. I became an anthropologist after being a mathematician and going off to the University of Nigeria as a 3rd year Sato student, discovering a whole new world, because I wanted to get away from my own background and my own quite repressive setting that I grew up in. And off I go. My first airplane trip of my life was from Chicago to New York to Nigeria. And I had that remarkable experience, but decided after I got married 57 years ago to work in the Middle East. Mary Jo was a Turkish specialist. we ended up going to Azerbaijan for another part of our career, because the Turks had their own revolution, their own actually a military coup, a leftist military coup in those days. And we did a lot of work, but I also have to say, I never felt my soul never belonged in Azerbaijan. That was the first third of our career. The second third of our career was working in American society, working in American mental health work, in particular focused on ethnic communities in the United States. All of those things that Donald Trump is now trying to eliminate a focus on minority mental health services, on mental health services for Black communities, for Hispanic communities, for Asian American communities, etc., was very central to the mission of the National Institute of Mental Health. When I came back to Harvard, and I spent years working broadly in that area, as did Mary Jo. And it was then, in my early 50s, that we decided, let's go someplace different. And Mary Jo had this opportunity to work in Aceh as part of a public health project. And off we came in 1996. And have been coming every year since then, except for 2 years. So there were some real differences in the work. Oddly enough, there's something from my time in Nigeria that I carry to Java. So it's a kind of long story, but the short version of it is that in Nigeria, I remember reading a book that was my first. It gave me my first anthropological experience. There was a book called Bantu Philosophy by an old Belgian priest. And it said, many missionaries think the Bantu people of West Africa have no philosophy because it's not written down. And it doesn't seem to make sense to contemporary European philosophy. He said, Bantu philosophy is essentially ontological. It's a theory of being, and it says that the person, the Muntu, is a quantity of force or energy, and that any individual lives his or her life trying to gain more energy, more force, and that can come from certain practices like meditation. It can come from the ancestors. It can come from certain objects in the world, and that people have contests between each other in terms of who has the most force or energy. And then I started hearing stories completely differently. Then I started talking to the Yoruba students, and they said, oh yes, there are 2 people running for office, 3 people running for office in our district. Each of them has a babalawo, a father of secrets, a medicine man, off in the village, off in the woods somewhere, that gives him his power. And so one of them, for instance, they told a story. One of them is invited to invites the other 2 politicians to his house. They arrive, he's not there, lightning strikes, burns the house down. But the 2 others walk away free because they have enough power themselves that he can't destroy them. And that this sort of contest of forces. I arrive in Java and I'm in the same world of Tenagadala, of all kinds of ways of acquiring force, of energy. Of course, it comes from a very different tradition. It comes from Hinduism. Hindu, Kajawan, of course, has that history and background to it. But it's also this world of force and energy that was largely absent, totally absent, I would say, in the Middle East. Middle East was still has the notions of, so what we call now ethnopsychology or of cultural psychology is sort of very classically part of the Western tradition in the Middle East, not surprisingly. And it's feels extremely different here. And so, I felt very at home when I arrived in Java. And then I had this remarkable experience of going to Aceh and suddenly seeing Java from the point of view of Achenese, which is a very different view of Aceh, of Java, very different view of Javanese if you are looking from the point of view. Anyhow, this is like a little personal story to sort of answer generally your question.
Okay, now I think there's a
Maybe there is-
participant from the Zoom. Fauzana. Fauzana.
Is it there?
Mas Irwan, ya sini kelihatannya.
Oh iya, sorry, oke. Ya, Fauzana masih di Zoom. Halo. Yeah, please unmute your speaker. Ya, silakan.
Oh. Masih unmute.
Masih unmute. Silakan.
Ya, Pak Iski. Oh, bisa buka. Oh, dari host.
Hello.
Ya,
Hello.
silakan.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. Hello, everyone. Good morning, and especially for Dr. Byron. Can I call you Dr. Byron? Good morning. My name is Fauzana. I am a course instructor in the state, in the Padang State University in West Sumatra. It's nice to meet you, and thank you so much for your very interesting and insightful presentation. I have a question related to your explanation regarding the anthropology of being haunted. As I understood, based on your explanation, that anthropology of being haunted has been used as elements or as a tool to explore the individuals or people who live with trauma, such as like a broken time. So I'd like to have your opinion or your suggestions regarding the future of anthropology, especially in Indonesia, anthropology, the science, and how do you see the future development of anthropology, development of anthropology of being haunted in the next coming years, especially in Indonesia, because my understanding, this kind of knowledge is quite related to psychology things, or that's related to the case, violent cases. And for example, in Aceh, people have the same cultural belief. What about people who live in they have the same experience, they have the same belief, the same culture. And what about people who live in a multicultural society? And how anthropology of being haunted will work to explore individuals that have experience in a broken time, who are from a different culture or different backgrounds. And my next questions, and I would like to have your suggestion. How do we promote this to solving the current situation that have faced many violence that caused by wars, intimidation, discrimination in the multicultural society? And how does it work to inspire other researchers, professionals, educators, governments, and policymakers? And that because currently, so there are many things happens, especially in Indonesia, and so many people have faced a traumatic experience in the past time. And the way individuals express their trauma is culturally different based on their cultural beliefs. So I'd like to have your suggestion, opinion about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think I'll face forward. If I stand this way, I'm probably you see my back. Even if I face this way, I'm seeing you. But I would just what I would say, of course, is that haunting is one concept among many that anthropologists have to make use of. I'm not arguing that all of anthropology needs to become about haunting or about psychological anthropology or about trauma. But that I also think that very fundamental to history is the kind of things that the question you asked, and the issue of dealing with history, dealing with traumatic past, is present as a part of the politics of history, the politics of remembering and paying constant attention to the complexity of the politics of remembering. And that's true in local politics, that's true in provincial politics, that's true in national politics. And the issue of the relationship, not just of the word trauma, but of words like hidden violence, is just part of the world that we live in. And one of the reasons that anthropologists, I think, have a special ability to work in this area. We go places that are hidden. That's what we do. And, when I teach methods in anthropology, I do a couple of things. One, I give people assignments of going places they don't belong. Because there are lots of places we kind of know about, but we've never been to. They're parts of our own society, and they're all over the place. The task of anthropologists is to go places we don't belong. Spend time there. And that going to places that are hidden away and making them become part of an open set of conversations. So, anthropologists have been very good at going to small ethnic communities and really understanding, like, what's their relation. But we've also been very good at going and talking to street kids and going into really poor communities, or going to politically incorrect Islamic groups, for instance, which I know Ariel has also spent his time working with at AE, for instance. Like, anthropologists go places we don't belong. And that, I think, part of the language of haunting is just one of the ways of really talking about dealing with those things that are hidden from view. And they're often hidden from view for very good reasons in power. Those in power hide from view whole sets of things in order to remain in power. That's the nature of power things, the nature of power. And that the task of anthropologists to constantly go behind the scenes, etc. The second is, it's true, I'm a psychological anthropologist, and I'm through an American anthropologist in that sense, but it also means that I believe deeply in what anthropologists, psychological anthropologists in the United States call person-centered ethnography or person-centered anthropology, which is to do really in-depth work with individual lives. I have a student, a former student, Andrea Gilberto, who worked in Afghanistan, and he worked with the Pushtun people, who are known to be like very oppressive. But he worked in a kind of psychodynamic way in which he sat with the same individual at different long periods of time. One of his persons, he had 75 hours of conversation. And he had to learn of course, he used psychological methods for listening for stories, but then also psychological techniques of looking at how the person associated one story with another story, with another story, not assuming simply that you begin by telling a life history. And so one of these people, for instance, people over time start telling him how they learn to be aggressive and how much pleasure they take in being aggressive, but at the same time, they feel guilty about it. And they don't want that part of themselves. They want a part of themselves that is more soft and sad, and that they find they're ambivalent about that part of themselves. And I would just say that kind of listening is something that one has to learn to assume two or three things. One, you constantly listen for stories, and you make narrative central to the work you do. Number two, you always assume about another person that you don't know what they're telling you. And that only over time will they be able to begin telling you more and more about things that they also can't express immediately. Therefore, this way of spending extended time with individuals is an important way of finding that beneath the surface of all kinds of people's stories are other stories. Below that are other stories, and those stories then begin to open up, and that we can never ahead of time predict. Even we think. I have a psychoanalyst friend who's an anthropologist who says, be careful at ever saying to someone, I understand what you mean, because you think you've had the same experience. You have to begin by assuming you don't understand what the person means. And that if you assume it's the same, it means the same thing as it does to you, you're likely to be wrong, and you're likely to stop listening as that person learns and tells you more about themselves. I don't know if that really, Farzana, if that really answers your questions. I would just say that, that haunting for me has become one way of addressing these kinds of issues, of things that are hidden away in society. That can include very specific historical memories in different settings. Can include, so those of, people that work in Bali, for instance, can also tell about what happened in 1965 in Bali, when 10% of the population was dead, and how that still resonates today in a society in which culturally the spirit is supposed to return, whereas many of these bodies and spirits ended up elsewhere completely. And so I would just say these are very, that there are very local and specific issues related to this that can be pursued, but in a way that helps us to pay attention to that which is hidden, tells us to not assume that those in power are telling us the proper story, and assumes that beneath every story of power are other stories, right? That there's always a kind of haunting of other stories present in any one story.
Okay. Any question from this audience? One, two or three, one, and then two, ya, satu lagi. Oke, dua dulu deh. Imam first. Ya, oke.
Sorry for the student, I take my. Pak Byron is I'm really interested in this, really a fascinating talk from you. And there is one thing that makes me curious when you try to share about your propositions about ontology, and you say that the situations of being haunted is the situations when we are either in between to know something and not knowing something. And it's triggering me a question whether do people have to learn how to encounter ghosts. Or, as many people also already said, ghost is an uncanny, sometimes it's really sudden, and when you talk about uncanny, you talk about something that's really outside your schemes of order of meanings, order of things. So I'm just curious whether the issues, and when we talk about the ghosts, do people have to learn how to encounter and experience ghosts, or do people actually can encounter those without learning? Because you mentioned about violence narrative, and you mentioned also about spectral media and everything, that when people is being teach how to know their ghost. So that's one of my questions.
Yeah, let me just answer that and then
Yeah.
go to the next one, but just to say, we of course live in a very complicated society here. And many people would say, I don't believe in ghosts, right?
Yeah.
And though the same person might tell a story of someone that had sixth sense.
Yeah.
But
I heard
he himself is ghost.
I remember one of the students came to Joe to talk about the sixth sense. From he's a graduate student. It is a wonderful set of questions around. But the number of people who I know who seem on the one hand quite rational, modern in a sense, but for whom the world of some kind of the other world is darkness. And it's one of the reasons that these issues seem to make so much sense to talk about in Southeast Asia. And in Southeast Asia, of course, there's also such histories of traumatic violence, of what the Vietnamese call the American War, not the Vietnam War, the American War. And how the spirit world and the world of the American War interact constantly in contemporary Vietnam. Of if you're in Thailand, my God, you're in a world of ghosts all the time, and of people of places that are haunted, and some very fascinating. So one of the things that in the annual review piece, I began also noting there are a few people who write what I would call haunted ethnographies, that is, who play with how to write in a very different kind of way of writing. There's a person who works in Thailand who wrote a book in which half of the book is written in his voice about sort of observing ethnography, observing lotteries, and half of the voice, he started out by acknowledging that for this woman there was a ghost, and by halfway through the ethnography, each chapter, every other chapter was actually written in the voice of the ghost. So it's the ghost speaking directly in this. So one is beginning to find new forms of writing actually that incorporate into the language of ethnography something very different. So do we have to learn to live with ghosts? Of course, in all kinds of ways, but it also matters whether you yourself walking and encountering ghosts. And they also become matters of play. So pochon. Films are matters of play, but people go because it still kind of also makes sense to them. And one of the interesting things is people who are psychotic actually see those things. And they come and tell you exactly what a pochon looks like. Exactly what is it, the great green giant of Bondorio? What is it? Right? They can tell you exactly what it looks like. So everybody says, oh, you know, I haven't seen it, but I know it's there. Oh, this person, when they become psychotic, when they become mad, they're actually able to see it. Which is quite, you know, itself a fascinating process. But of course, what they see in Bali is a little different than what they see in, maybe because in Bali there are different spirits.
And with different spirits, they will experience different kind of experience of haunting or not haunting, right? I remember Tanya Lupin works on comparing Ghana, Sri Lanka, and US, and
Right.
on hearing voices of schizophrenia.
Right.
It's really quite different, right?
Right.
For the Ghana, they hear voice of God, and the US, they hear voice of people urging people to suicide. And
Right.
so that's the reason why I try to ask you. But this is we need to learn how to know the ghost.
Yeah. No, it's, you know, Tanya's work is also really interesting with this kind of way. You know, she began again going to a place that kind of hidden from anthropologists, going to Christian groups.
Oh yeah.
You know, that's where she began, was working with Christian groups who would describe hearing the voice of God.
Yeah.
And she took it seriously, as opposed to making psychologically trying to like explain it. No, she took seriously that people experience and talk with God.
Mm.
And then what is the relationship between that? So she then followed, part of the methodology was to actually look at these kinds of Christian groups in other societies, in Thailand. So she, in each society, she would go to outside of these Christian missionary groups who would come in which people like speak in voices. It's also true in Korea. There's a whole movement of Koreans who are very involved in this book. So Christianity has taken this form all over the world, and she's gotten interested in that. But she takes seriously hearing voices. In treatment of people with schizophrenia, actually, the hearing voices movement actually became a very powerful therapeutic form. It turns out that many of us talk with people who are psychotic without ever really in detail asking them carefully about what the voice, who the voice, about their voices. For psychiatrists, they quickly say, you don't need to ask about the content, you don't need to ask about that. You just begin with knowing that this is a, you know, that this is a hallucination. And by giving it a name. What this whole hearing voices movement did was begin having people themselves who have had psychotic experience form groups themselves and tell each other about the voices they heard. And tell each other their experience with voices and the weirdness of what that experience is like. And then how people bother them, how the voices bother them, how the voices then, what they do about it, how they respond. I have a psychiatrist friend here in Jakarta who said when he sees people often in the very early stages of an illness who are Christian, they will have this very powerful sense that God wants them to do so. And then the next thing is they begin hearing whispering. And only later do they actually begin hearing the voice as such. It's like a kind of something that emerges over time. And so what I would say is like, I found myself realizing, oh my God, I didn't actually talk to people very much. I heard about it, they would tell. They didn't really want to talk about it unless you start asking. As with Babandi went to one of his old patients. This old woman, he talked with her. She'd been hearing these voices. He says, you're really Gillette. And she just learns to like ignore them. So people are able to talk about what the voice is like and how they deal with them. And so it's it is present in all kinds of ways. So, I just think exploring these issues, I do think that all kinds of forms in Southeast Asia that really take attention to the experiences people have of the other world is always really critical and taking it seriously. I know there's one more.
Ya, satu lagi.
Iya, boleh.
Terakhir.
Oke,
Terakhir.
nggak bisa bicara lama tahun.
Sorry that I was late during the lecture, but my question, I think I have two questions. The second is very simple, but my first question is very contextual and very tailored. In a modern setting where the perpetrator of the violence of this particular setting is still alive, and of course the victim is, of course, haunted by those memory of violence. Do you think there should be another particular way of us, of course, as you an anthropologist of this case, trying to assist and also help them through trying to process this trauma? Because from what I, of course, heard from what you said, all of these not so recent cases, I would assume that most of the they're haunted by actual ghosts, like spirits of people that are already dead. But what about the people that are haunted by actual living people? Like all of these perpetrators are just roaming around, like they're free, and while all of the victims are just haunted by those violent memories. I wonder if there is a way for me to also apply hauntology onto case assistance, since I work as a case assistant in a particular organization. But also my second question to you is, whether you realize it or not, I think you do help them process all of those traumas, those communities that you go, that you talk to. How do you carry all of those burdens? And like, how do you also regulate yourself so that it's also stable to you? Because you wouldn't want to be burnt out because you hear all of those haunting, devastating cases about these people. I think that's all. Thank you.
Yeah, no, those are clinical questions. And they're really important clinical questions. And yes, in some settings, they have a long historical. So, for instance, Rob Lemelson, the filmmaker, I know Ario and some of you know about, has done years and years of filmmaking, and he did it, including working with one of his assistants, who was an anthropologist, somebody I know very well, who was Balinese, who in one of the films, in 42 Years of Silence, 40 Years of Silence, he went and confronted his uncle for the first time about how this uncle had turned his father in and had him murdered. And those families lived side by side without speaking to each other for about this for generations. So those things exist within families. I suspect you're also working with domestic violence and with violence against women.
Yes. Sexual violence too.
Sexual violence against women, against kids, etc. In some cases with people who continue to live with a violent partner, and other cases who live away but still are, that person is present because they share kids or whatever. And it was interesting. Well, this time being in Aceh, because there is a Sasakawa Peace Foundation that is supporting ongoing work up in the hills, up in Aceh Tengah and in Veneria, doing groups with people who are over, for whom, so I feel like our work was great. We did 75 villages out of 5,000 in Aceh. That means lots and lots and lots of people have never had any of the kind of treatment that our work did. Many people still live with that trauma. And so Sasakawa is also like helping develop some tools for doing with that. But along with it came someone who was my student years ago, a Japanese woman who is a psychiatrist who's gone back. She's become the real specialist in domestic violence in Japan. And so what I know is that, you know, that what you're talking about is very important clinical set of issues about how do you really, you know, and I would just say for everybody, the most important thing is you never start with an assumption that just asking people to tell their story is going to make it better. The first thing you need to be very careful about asking people about their traumatic experience because they can be re-traumatized. And right, you have to be, this is not something that, you know, there are still people that have this fantasy. Oh, if you could only tell your story, you get better. It's not true at all. It's not how you deal with it. It's not how you deal with sexual violence. So I'm sure you know this, but I would just say that knowing what you're doing and being guided clinically, the reason that I felt comfortable in Aceh during the intervention in going and asking people to talk about themselves in depth, more in depth, is because they'd already processed it a lot with their clinician. I would be, and I even worry about the fact, so these studies that we did, which is to ask people, have you ever experienced X? Was yes or no. But it was never just yes or no. It was always, oh my God. And people would start remembering and they would start talking about it. And in terms of your last question, no, something that I should have known better and done better was to take better care of our interviews. We didn't do as good as we should. Of course, I experienced a lot. I'm a good, so, you know, I like turned it into social theory. My own experience of talking about haunting grows out of how do I deal with it was partly by writing theoretical, right? That's one of the ways that we do things is of dealing with our own experience. But of course I had the experience. I come from Aceh and woke up in the middle of the night in a terror that my house was surrounded by police and I was trying to figure out in a kind of nightmare how to get out of my house. So yeah, it affects us. And if you're doing projects like this, you need to take care of the people who are doing the interviewing. You need to take care of yourself. And that's, you know, that's clinically true. So, you know, I think it helps to spend, I'm glad you're doing this work. I think having clinical experience allows you to be able to talk about things in a way that you need to have training to talk with anybody about these considerations. So I think it's like, you know, I think this is the whole issue of really doing individual therapy with individuals who've been traumatized, whether they're still in relationship, what kind of complicated relationship they're in. You know, it's a matter of very complicated therapeutic relationship. There are, of course, places where the military perpetrators are still present, for the police. And you know, one of the things we know is that there's not enough work done with perpetrators to help them process what they've done and to help them find other ways to become different people. Because often people are put into this. So, you know, there's also interesting work with on domestic violence, working with the abusers as well. So I'm sure you can, but I'm just saying, these are really important clinical issues. And if these are not matters to play lightly.
Okay, I think we have to wrap up this lecture and then big applause to Professor Byron. I think we are recording this process, right? So I hope that we can maybe later, right? If somebody we are going to upload in the YouTube.
Yeah,
by permission, by permission.
it would be great if we can disseminate the.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think I hope that the lecture and then the discussion is inspiring us, and then especially for the anthropological students. Can and then we hope that maybe next time if Prof. Byron is coming to Indonesia, and then I hope that we can invite you again, right? And, you said that at least you twice a year you come to Indonesia, yeah? So we have to hope to meet Pak Byron again. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, and then applause to all.